Welcome to You Belong in the C-Suite podcast. You are ambitious in life and in your career, but something is missing. You want to bring more of your passion to what you do. Because let's be honest, you pour a ton into your work, and it needs to mean more. I'm your host, Laura Eigel. I'm a mom, wife, PhD, coach, advocate, introvert, and indoor rowing fanatic. I'm passionate about living a life that's in line with my values. We'll give you the actionable tips and tools you need to lead with your values, make a difference, and have career success. The world needs more diversity and authenticity in the top jobs at organizations. Your leadership belongs there. You belong in the C-Suite. My second book, Values First Teams: How to Build a Culture That's Synchronized for Success, launches on May 20th. Miscommunication, misalignment, missed deadlines. Every leader knows the frustration of a team that feels more like a tug of war than a unified force. And in today's whirlwind of deadlines and demands, it's easy to lose sight of the why behind the work, leaving your team feeling disconnected and disengaged. In Values First Teams, I'm sharing my proven framework for building an engaging team culture, where shared values create stronger results and individual efforts harmonize to achieve a powerful collective momentum. It's more than just a leadership book. Values First Teams is a guide for building a workplace where everyone is aligned, engaged, and rowing in the same direction. Values First Teams launches on May 20th, 2025. Learn more at thecatchgroup.com/valuesfirstteams. Welcome to the You Belong in the C-Suite podcast. I'm your host, Laura Eigel. And in today's episode, I'm joined by our guest, Anant Nyshadham. Anant is a development economist, tenured professor at the University of Michigan Ross School of Business, and co-founder of Good Business Lab. Anant's research and the work of Good Business Lab have been focused on finding missed opportunities to invest in workers around the world to increase both welfare of workers and the productivity of firms. Anant's story is a powerful one. He grew up in a small town in the South, the son of immigrant parents surrounded by systemic inequities and extreme poverty. His early experiences shaped a deep sense of resilience, curiosity, and justice that he carried with him through his academic journey, all the way to earning a PhD and launching field experiments that now span continents. In our conversation, Anant opens up about the unexpected path that led him from nearly dropping out of college to building a globally recognized social enterprise. He shares what it really takes to scale impact at the intersection of business and worker well-being, and how his team at Good Business Lab partners with some of the world's largest companies to improve working conditions, especially for women in frontline roles. We talked about the power of humility and leadership, how frontline managers and workers often hold the solutions companies need most, and why building soft skills in factories isn't a nice to have, it's a business imperative. You'll hear about the tools they've created to give workers a voice, to improve retention, and to boost productivity in ways that are sustainable, data-driven, and deeply human. Our conversation is at the intersection of economics, social impact, and business strategy. I know that you'll learn a lot from my conversation with Anant and from his experience, and it may even help you think about the work you are doing differently. Let's get started. Well, I want to welcome you to the You Belong in the C-Suite podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Very excited to chat.
Yeah, I'm excited about connecting and really just learning more about the work that you're doing. But before we get into that, I want to learn just more about you and your career. So do you mind just telling us a bit more about your career story and your life? I like to hear about like all things. So where you grew up, wherever you want to start, we'd love to hear and learn more about you.
Great. I love to talk, so that should and talk about myself. It's my favorite subject. No. Yeah, so I think my story starts pretty early on. I grew up in a very small town in the South in Georgia. And I mean, I was born in New York. My parents were immigrants at different points in their lives. And so it wasn't, I was certainly the odd person out there, but it was a very unique place to grow up. Great in a lot of ways, challenging in some ways. But I think it had a profound effect on me. I mean, both personally in the sense that I developed into an extrovert and kind of a big, confident personality to deal with, lots of racism that existed and so on, tough skin, but soft underneath. But also I think I really internalized the extreme poverty that we were surrounded with. I mean, it was a town of 3,500 people, it was an old mill town, so it was used to be the textile center, one of the very few textile centers in the U.S. So it's a town called West Point, Georgia, and West Point Pepperell became West Point Stevens, and but by the time we got there, those jobs were gone, and so you're seeing the kind of the remains of a place that used to be a vibrant, certainly laboring kind of town, but had vibrant employment and nothing else came in. And so, you drove by the factory that was being dismantled. I mean, for 30 years, one brick at a time, very slowly crumbling, but nothing inside. And the town kind of went along with that. So, I went to school in Alabama up until high school because, it was only 5 minutes away. It was a private school technically, but, it's one of those schools that's like $100 tuition, which actually in the South, they call these kind of white academies. You're in Texas, right? So, where it's just enough historically to keep, people of color out. And so, but the reason for that is that there was no public school in our town. There was no tax money to build up a school that had long since kind of become dilapidated. And so if I wanted to go to public school, I'd have to go 40 minutes, away from home. Then in high school, actually, I got a scholarship to a another private school in Columbus that was actually 40, 45 minutes away. Um, and it was the big school in the sense that the school I was in before had 18 to 20 kids per grade, and this one had 50 kids per grade. And so, but it was a much more affluent community and so on. And so it was a kind of a culture shock. But I think that certainly had a profound effect on what ultimately would be what I devoted my life to. And then the other thing I think was that, even though I was born and brought up here, and even my mom, for example, her two older brothers were born in the US, then they went back to India, then they came back. So it was kind of in between. We didn't have so much family in India, but we did, when I was younger, go back and visit. So we visited our ancestral land in South, in Andhra Pradesh. It's kind of like a rice growing village called Dantalur. And I distinctly remember, first of all, how fun it was to just play in the fields and, like climb big hay bales and things like this, but and like pump water from a well and waste it probably now that I think about it. But as I got a bit older and I saw that, then I really started to see an even, more extreme level of poverty, but resilience in an interesting way, that people were happy and lived their lives as best as they could. It was just a hard limit to the access to opportunities and the outside world. And so I think those two things kind of lingered on my brain. And as I got older, it took me a very long time to get serious. I was a musician at the time, and I just wanted to hang out with my band. And luckily things came easy to me in school. It wasn't particularly good schools that I was going to, but things came easy to me, so I didn't apply myself at all, and it was okay. Really into college, I got my sister had gone to University of Pennsylvania and was there for a couple of years. She and I were very, very close. Especially due to lots of childhood difficulties we had. But I applied to one school, and so I just was going to go there wherever she was. And I told my mom that, well, they have the best business program for undergrad, so I'm going to be, I'm going to do business. And then my mom looked at me with my cut off kurtas and long hair and earrings, and was like, okay, this is a waste of your time. There's no way this is gonna work out. And I think within the first week, I called her up and was like, I made a huge mistake. I hate this. This is terrible, and I want to drop out. And she didn't let me because I didn't have another plan. She's like, if you can come up with even a single other thing you're passionate about and you want to do, then do that. But like until then, just, suck it up. And so again, luckily kind of things were easy enough. I wasn't passionate about stuff, but I got through school pretty early, actually a year early because my family was having like some financial concerns. And so I didn't want to stay any longer than I had to. And so I left school early, but I really kind of fell into the idea of academics. Now, in retrospect, it actually makes a lot of sense. But I think at the time, no one had ever brought it up to me or thought that it was something to do. South Asian Americans tend to have a very, and lots of immigrants tend to have a very like professional bias. These are low risk occupations. Be a doctor, you'll always have a job. Be an engineer, you'll always have a job. Now more and more business, but that wasn't even a big thing back then. It seemed too risky. And so I had actually just asked a friend who I used to play music with, like who's a couple years older than me, hey, what are you doing after you graduate? He was graduating that year when I was a freshman. And he said, oh, I'm going to go to Yale and do a PhD in development economics. And then I thought, yeah, I'm going to do that. That's what I'm going to do. And so then I asked him, and he's like, well, you should probably start taking some math and you should be doing this. And so I kind of like squeezed in the requirements and so on, and somehow just fell in love with the notion, the romantic notion of being an academic, such as it was, but had no idea what it meant to do that at all. I mean, well into the first year of my PhD, I had no idea. I also didn't know what it was like to study or be challenged. And so, that was a really, really hard transition. I spent a lot of my life thinking I was like the smartest person on earth and things were just easy and no big deal. And then you go to that type of community and you're like, oh, wow, I might be the dumbest person here. But that was a very humbling and very important moment that did two things. One was challenge for that from then on my notion that I like knew everything and could do everything, and that it totally flipped my perspective to what a smart person does is figure out what they don't know,
Mm.
and they may not, and is aware of the fact that they may not go and learn all of those things, but what do they not know? What do other people know? Constantly ask yourself, even the things you think you know, are you sure? Because in life there's not going to be midterms and whatever where you fail them like I do, and then you realize, oh, you got to study and catch up. But that's how I kind of approached my work all throughout. And then the other thing it did actually was really challenge me as to whether I knew what I wanted to do. I mean, I had really gone to grad school to hide from responsibility and working. I had kind of gotten interviews for Goldman Sachs internships and things like that, and all my friends were doing that stuff. We're all in finance, and it just seemed horrible. It seemed a very unmotivating thing to do. I don't want to speak ill of anybody, what other people are doing. For me, I just I needed to be in love with something I was going to do, or I wasn't going to do it. Very simply. And I would rather do nothing. And I was very good at doing nothing. So I I wasn't in love with that. I didn't know what I was in love with. But grad school, I mean, somewhere even in the first year, it was where it was beating me down. I really fell in love with these tools and the possibilities and so on. And then soon after, so somewhere in the middle, actually, I got a bit burnt out and wondered whether this was the right path for me, as all my friends were, starting to join private equity funds and venture cap funds, obviously earning a lot of money. I was earning a PhD stipend, which even that I was, lucky to get. But so I dropped out for a year and joined like an agricultural supplement company that was trying to expand to Africa. And it was from, it was like a friend of a friend, an uncle of a friend from Alabama, and they didn't know anybody else who knew anything about the developing world. I'd been to Kenya exactly one time. And so they, hired me to be their director of global development. And I think I was 21 years old or something like that. But I spent a year going out there, doing some stuff, trying to work on deals with, members of parliament and presidents and so on, which was really a crazy experience. But it was what I needed to realize that I may not be good at this, but I certainly don't love it. And I need both in any case. Otherwise, I'm just not going to apply myself. And I came back to grad school realizing that I did love this. I wasn't sure if I was good at it. And then but I would try. And then I'd spend the next 4 or 5 years kind of proving to myself that I was good at it, trying to say, okay, well, this is the amount that other people are producing. Go do some multiple of that to be sure, really risk averse. Is that if I just hit that, then I don't know, that's in the margin of error. I might still be bad at this. I don't know. And that's where this kind of that started the whole engine, and now I don't know how to turn it off, I guess, to some degree. But right after I graduated from the PhD, I had this opportunity. Up till then, I was really just studying methods. My PhD was kind of in applied econometrics. I knew I wanted to do development, but I didn't have a way to bring it back. I wasn't sure. So I just was, all kind of hopped up on methods and then looking for something to do. Went to my 5-year reunion for grad school, sorry, for undergrad, and ran into a friend of mine who I used to play basketball with when we weren't super, super close, but I knew him well enough. But I guess I didn't know very much about his life. I mean, I was telling him what I was doing. He was saying, "Oh, hey, so, if you're interested in development stuff, my family owns a few garment factories in India. We're doing this program for frontline workers. They're mostly women, but it's about, kind of teaching them life skills and soft skills. And you should come and check it out." And so then, I had this a light bulb went off, and I was like, "Oh, I might be able to run an experiment here and get a nice project out of this." So I went like a month or two later to India and found out that they don't, own a couple factories. They own like all the factories. It's like the largest group in India, and they had even then, I don't know, some 50 factories and more now. But it started the whole thing. It started the whole vision for our lab, and everything was right there, right after grad school. And I really haven't done anything else since. I mean, everything has been in service of this notion that I think as we got there, we talked to CEOs, and there was something you even mentioned earlier, which is when you talk to CEOs, even C-suites in general, even the most well-meaning, they're devoted to their work. That company really is devoted to growth because it employs a lot of women. And in India, that's a hard thing to do. And so, if you talk to the head of the company, my friend's dad, you know, he says very simply, I mean, lots of other families have gotten out of this industry. We keep going because look at all the women we can employ. Let's just keep going, more grow, as much as you can to employ more women. But I realized that, wow, I mean, there are some cities or even countries that are the size of these workforces. So all this work that we're seeing, many of my colleagues do great work to try to go through government and identify how use public funds as efficiently as possible and test which programs work and deliver the most impact. You might be able to do this more efficiently in the private sector. Some things, I'm not saying everything, but things, investments where you could align the goals of the firm with the needs of the worker. Well, it might even be that the firm should be the one to invest and drive these types of things. So in a stylized example, suppose, you know, workers have, there's a high incidence of bad eyesight, which is true in amongst, the even young workers in developing countries. The government should certainly provide eye screening and then cheap glasses, and there are NGOs that do that type of stuff. But it's extremely difficult to get touch points with all of these people. And so, on the other hand, a firm that has hundreds of thousands of workers coming to work every day could do this in 2 days. Bring a bunch of, bring a couple of ophthalmologists, do some screening, and you're done. Or optometrists, um, and then the glasses subsidies are there. They just can't find the people. And so this is actually an experiment we're running now, but it's I think the simplest version of anything that's health related. Well, if the person can see, it's gonna their eyesight improves when they're 30, and it's way too early for them to, or late 20s, and way too early for them to be struggling with this, and it's such a correctable problem. You can really totally change their lives, but you also make them productive. They don't have to drop out of the workforce. They're not making errors. They're much faster at their work. And so the firm should care, about that. And I think we saw an opportunity here where the CEOs and COOs really cared about this stuff, but were too far detached from the front lines to know what the real problems were. I mean, what do they see? They see that workers turn over a lot. They can't keep them in the factory floor, and there's lots of reasons for that. There's a high absenteeism, and output per worker is really low, you know, and half of maybe what it could be in the world in that setting. Um, but there's so many root causes to that. You can't really chip away at that problem unless you truly understand the what's driving it. And so that's where we saw an opportunity to start illuminating, okay, what are these root causes? Can we then design solutions? So often you find good solutions that never scale because they're not made usable by the people who need to use them, not by the people who designed them, but the people who ultimately need to take them up. And so we started to formalize all of this into a lab. It took a few years to create the lab. But ultimately, we were already doing the work from 2012. We started running this first experiment and doing other projects inside of it, and so on, and just, you know, step by step started realizing, wow, there might be an opportunity here. It's kind of crazy that this is novel,
Mhm.
but there might be an opportunity here to just create evidence and create an appetite for evidence for these policies that are, really high dollar and could be really high impact, but often are kind of wasted to some degree, or not done at all because, the returns are unknown. Um, and so that's where it was. And I kind of found myself back home. I really wanted a reason to go back to India and eat, and I had no family left. So I needed to find projects in India. I had a specific conversation with my colleague, who, by the way, is the same guy who told me about the PhD, the concept of a PhD to begin with. We played music together my freshman year of college, and then I followed him to grad school. He likes to say that he was my mentor, but it just happened to be a place where I knew somebody. But and we've worked on almost exclusively with each other ever since. So now 20 years or so doing this together.
I love so many of the themes in your story. And I'd love to ask another question to see if some of these themes come through here. But a couple of themes that I heard a lot about connection, you in connection with like deep relationships to community, to people, right? That helped you either stay grounded in your path or to form new paths. I also heard really about resilience too, about you and about the communities that you have been in and are helping. And then just this idea of just continual learning and growing tied to your own career fulfillment. So I love to ask, like, what are some of your core values that have kind of impacted that career and and it feels like some of those I might have picked up on in your story, but tell me more about that and how have those core values kind of shaped or impacted your leadership style or career as you've gone?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and probably one that I should ask myself more often. I'd have a more ready answer. You did a good job of answering it for me, I think, to some degree, but drawing themes. But I think one definitely is humility. I think so many people who have known me along my life would probably laugh a bit at that, in the sense that I've never, at least outwardly, lacked for confidence. And I think in a lot of ways, actually, I've accomplished things I had no business accomplishing because I just didn't entertain the possibility that I couldn't do it or that it wouldn't happen. Like I said, I applied to one school that's a very competitive school and had no backup plan. And my mom was freaking out and she was like, well, you might want to apply here, and Harvard and Yale. Why do you want to go here? Not that those are easy schools to get in. I'm just saying, some diversification would be nice. But I just didn't entertain the possibility that it wouldn't happen. And that served me really well up until a point. And then I think the humility, like I said, really hit in graduate school, with the limitations of my, natural intelligence. Um, but that translated so much into everything I was going to try to do. Challenge every notion I have or every understanding I have about what these problems are, where they come from, identify in other people where, wait a minute, they're telling me this, but how do they know that? And how sure are they about that? And, they might be right, but they might also be a little bit wrong. And let's go find out and let's ask and let's, get more data points and so on. And so I think that that's not always the case, even in my field, amongst academics who are researchers. Um, it's easy to presuppose the endpoint to some degree, and it sounds reasonable and it makes sense. And then, okay, we're going to spend a lot of time doing the math to prove it. But then when we take it to the data, some things don't fit, um, and we don't know where to go from there, you know? Um, Whereas I think what we've learned over time is just if you stay extremely humble as much as you can along the way, that yes, you've got the skills to do things. Okay. Like I think that's the distinction that I've had in my life is like, look, it's good to trust your skills. It's good to trust your capabilities. Um, because that keeps you going. That's maybe that resilience bit is that you suffer a lot of defeats. And it's if you start telling yourself, yeah, I can't do this, or maybe I can't, or maybe I'm not the one, or maybe this is not doable, then yeah, you'll certainly give up. Sometimes it's the right thing to do, but a lot of times it's not the right thing to do. But you need to be humble about the outcomes, you know? I can do this, but I'm gonna need to challenge myself. How am I gonna know when I'm done? You know, these types of things. How do I measure success? And is there another way to measure success? And is once I get to a certain point, is this really success? In an academic career, that really I think is important in the sense that I remember so distinctly wondering whether I could complete a paper, then wondering if I could complete a set of papers, then wondering if I could publish one of those papers in economics. You have these kind of what they call colloquially the top five, which really kind of tend to be, it's very hard to get a publication in one of those top general interest journals. And for many, many schools, even one of those can be kind of the bar for tenure. We have really long papers and stuff. And so a full career could be a couple of papers in one of those. So then I thought really, I was really worried about, can I do that? Well, then I got, thankfully, one of those and then a few of those. And then, now at this stage of my career, I'm starting to realize, like, well, what does one more or a few more of those do? Success isn't that anymore. It was always about having an impact at scale, and nobody reads my papers, so that's okay. I'm not hurt by it, but and nobody even reads, not nobody, but like, not so many read even the Harvard Business Review versions of them, or, some degree, maybe the Economist article that's written about them and stuff, which is great. All of that's awesome. But I think we've realized like impact doesn't come just by putting ideas out in the world. Like if you want to actually participate in the impact, that this is now the starting point.
Yeah.
You know some things now. Now I can feel confident even after challenging myself that, okay, there are a few things I know. I know these things work and I know these things are opportunities to change. Um, so now there's a new goal, Now how do you go do this and do this as much as you can and do it everywhere, sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you're realizing some of that impact through the Good Business Lab. And so tell me more about the mission of the lab. And I'm really interested for you to tell us more about the PACE program and the kinds of things that you're doing to build capability that are generally not really the traditional things when you think about building capability in frontline. So tell me more about both.
Yeah. Great. I thank you for the question. So, at first, Good Business Lab was, sort of a construct of necessity in the sense that we were starting to do more and more experiments in the field, mostly in India at the time. And there were other, like, there's, a very well-known and probably the first group that created experiments and brought experiments to development economics, JPAL, that came out of MIT, that was doing a lot of this, but there really weren't very many experiments inside firms. And we realized that that's a different animal, that, there's so much change management, so much, coordination across hierarchies of interest in this program, belief in this program, or whatever it might be, and so on, and sensitivities. You're not remotely, if you do experiments in villages and so on, you know, you can be an important intervention in the lives of everybody around. If you do this in a workplace, you're like the least important thing around, in the sense that they don't know that what you're doing means anything or works. They may even be, unconvinced that it's worth trying. And they've got targets to meet and things to do. And, it's a factory that's moving. And so all of those sensitivities, I think, are what made us realize, like, okay, well, this human capital doesn't exist in the market. We need to create it, and then we'd be fools to let it go after we created it. So we just wanted to create a structure that we could, okay, have workers do stuff, enumerators, build in quality to one study and then, leverage that for the next one and the next one and so on. But we also wanted a platform to kind of harmonize all of this stuff. And we thought, okay, if we can get a lab structure and then start devoting resources towards marketing and comms and translating this evidence into different formats, that also can be a kind of an economy of scale we can generate or leverage. But I think where the challenge we're facing right now, and I think where the vision really kind of not ends, but what we need to do to complete the vision is figure out how to really drive impact at scale. And it's not, I think we knew it wasn't going to be trivial, but there are new challenges that pop up along the way. So initially, I remember when we were first dreaming up this first experiment, PACE experiment, which is the one that I had actually alluded to earlier, also very first opportunity we had. It was, at least from our academic perspective, like a soft skills intervention for frontline machine operators, for women in particular, who in that context, they're younger, this is their first foray into formal work. This is their first foray outside of their very, insular social networks in rural areas. And so they're very demure, and the society kind of perpetuates that. It doesn't really give so many opportunities. You have to go take opportunities to be, a bigger personality or have a bigger voice. And so this taught, amongst other things, extroversion and teamwork and the ability to communicate with your manager and communicate with each other and so on. But I remember when we were first dreaming up, we were very far away from any results, but we were kind of designing the trial and so on. Same friend and I, actually we went on a ski trip to celebrate that I had graduated from the PhD, which seemed like it would never happen. And like every time we would ski down the slopes and then we'd get on the lift, and every time at the lift we'd like develop the idea a little bit more and be like, well, wait a minute, like you think there could be productivity effects of this? Because that's crazy. That you scale that by 100,000 workers. Then we'd ski down, we'd come back and be like, but don't they know? Like, how do they not know that this might increase productivity? And so, well, it's hard to experiment. And, like we started thinking about, okay, well, they've got a lot of other things to do. And the universe over which to search for possible improvements is arguably infinite. So, they don't have the expertise that we have. They don't have the ability to kind of invest in this stuff. Okay. So one more at a time. And so I think step by step, we realized, okay, there really might be a fundamental friction here. Sorry, I'm using lots of economics jargon, but there might be a fundamental issue here in this market, which is that experimentation for firms is costly. They might know that the problems exist, but it's not obvious what the roots of those problems are or how to solve them. But they're not in the business of identifying and solving those problems. They've got other first order things to do, like make garments and deliver them on time, or make cars or whatever. So there is an opportunity for us to come in and create a public good, which is that experimentation and then the information and so on. And we were really excited about that. And then somewhere like 5-7 years in, we realized that it still just hit a wall. I mean, we would went to the boards of these companies that were invested in the programs, and say, okay, well, now you need to do this and scale this up into this other thing. And it'd be great. Like, let us know when you have one and we'll buy it. And, I just thought that like, well, look at the ROI I'm showing you. It's like, 60x or whatever. You should figure out how to create this in your company. But even with those types of returns, which sometimes they don't believe anyway, no matter how great our experimental methods are, there's still some risk or doubt around it. But also they just don't have the skills. That's not what they're optimized to do. And so we realize that it's more than knowledge. It is knowledge for sure, but it's more than knowledge that's missing here. This is not a primary market where B2B SaaS businesses are trying to create these types of tools. You do need to motivate foundations that do developmental work and fund the Gates Foundation and so on to subsidize the public good of creating the knowledge, but even further, give a runway to create the actual product or service that can be scaled up, because that runway is long and you're going to have to make a bunch of mistakes and adoption is going to be slow because you're changing people's minds about fundamental ways of business. Um, and so that's where we are now. We've now generated, I think, really great evidence on worker voice, on any tool that can allow a worker at any level to communicate to the highest levels issues they're facing. Everything as simple as, hey, my paycheck didn't was wrong this month, or I'm being harassed on the factory floor, or even I want to work, but my child is sick and no one else can, so I don't know what to do. I think I'm going to have to leave the factory or whatever. Um, you know, Knowledge is power. Not all of those things are things that the firm could do anything about, but the initial response we got was like, we don't want a documentation of all of these issues that these workers are raising. We have 100,000 workers. It's a hard business to be in, even with the best intentions. There's going to be crazy stuff going on, you know, but hey, even more so in the age of social media, these things don't stay in silos for very long. If you have the information, you can potentially act and act fast and direct your efforts where they're needed most. Um, and if you don't, this is every one of these is a potential scandal or major crisis waiting to happen. And that slowly started changing the minds of management too. But we had to create a tool where they had control of the data. Every worker could use it, though. It's useless if there are lots of tools on the market, but smartphone penetration is not that high in India, for example, and functional penetration is even lower. Like in the sense that, you know, yes, there's technically a smartphone in my house, but the woman never uses it and, doesn't feel comfortable telling it her secrets or whatever. So we had to get a very low tech version of that. And so like step by step, these are examples of how we not only figured out what we thought were some of the problems that, hey, there are simple things here where the worker is not feeling valued and has problems that are totally solvable and that the firm would want to solve because then the worker would be less likely to leave or be more productive or show up for work, whatever. And that's true for so many, maybe all of the workers at some point, over the course of even a month or a year. But also that, okay, well, you need to have the solution be simple enough for them to use it, and then actually the last of three experiments we ran for this, which is really, I think, exciting, was that we also showed that if you can get reductions in turnover, reductions in absenteeism from the existence of the tool, which is pretty powerful. 3 or 4% might use it over the course of a year, but the fact that it's there is option value. The worker believes that whenever they do have a problem, they're not going to have to just eat it and leave, or just deal with it, suck it up. They have an avenue. But we actually saw productivity, I mean, day to day, hour to hour productivity increases when we built a culture around it. So we created this kind of gamified incentive scheme for HR teams to kind of compete against each other at different factories, and the utilization was way higher, the clearance rates were way better, and the time to clearance was way shorter, and all of that, made the difference. That was the incremental difference in our experiment to actually even leveraging, I mean, creating productivity benefits. And so now, okay, so now you've got a tool, you've got a problem, you've got a solution that's adoptable that you've created with the people who need to adopt it, and now you've turned it into a tool that can be implemented at scale. But this is a very hard population to serve and make any money. So, ours is still a social enterprise, but we need to attract good talent. I want to attract a C-suite that cares about this problem. Well, they need to be compensated. And then I want to have it, create earnings that can be used to grow and have an incentive to grow. But there's a reason why, most people don't serve this population. It's very low margin. And you're kind of chipping away at this notion that it's not worth it to invest in these workers. One, there's so many of them, their salaries are relatively low. So as a percentage of what I'm paying them, how much am I going to invest in terms of amenities and other things? And they're going to leave me anyway. So I'm going to, if I train these workers, they're going to leave anyway. The math actually works out really easily, but I think what sometimes simple notion that firms fail to realize is that everyone leaves everything. Of course, the worker's going to leave you eventually. But if you delay it for a few months, 6 months, a year, and then you do that for 100,000 workers, you're benefiting integral under the curve. And that integral under the curve is tremendously valuable for something that's such a major cost center, like labor, because the cost of trying to replace that worker is just tremendous, and then retrain them and then bring the new worker up to the productivity of the old worker and so on. So the challenge that we're at now, so we have this tool on worker voice, we have a tool for screening managers, frontline managers, just one level up, who often get ignored in soft skills. That's the other side of the coin, right? Yes, we can empower the frontline workers as much as possible, but if the frontline managers are not enlightened, then you're still going to have the same amount of harassment and so on. And I reject the notion that thousands of these people are just terrible human beings. They are under pressure and they don't know any other way. So we've demonstrated in trials that if you teach them a different way, they can really change their management style. It can be vastly productive. And that's my 60x numbers. We found that a curriculum that we generated and just gave like a really analog classroom way to these factory supervisors, like line supervisors, generated like 60x returns in terms of flow productivity, mainly from flow productivity, and some other outcomes. And it's persisted for the 18 months that we followed this, and no reason to believe it didn't persist after that. So even that 60x number is, truncated. But and then turn that into so that's a screening tool to see who has these skills, and then a targeted training tool to quickly remediate those skills for anyone who doesn't have them. Another benefit of that is to level the playing field for women to advance, who often are thought to not have what it takes, or so on. Well, here's an objective measurement that shows, number one, they actually tend to have more what it takes, if anything. And more importantly, it doesn't matter. Everyone's idiosyncratic. If there's a deficiency, it's easily remediated. It's not a reason to not consider them. And then we've got, I think, the latest success that I'm really, really excited about is earned wage access, which is not new. It's an issue and a solution that exists here in the U.S. and everywhere in the world. But waiting a week to get your paycheck for people who are up against, the real poverty constraint. I may not be able to meet rent. I may not be able to pay the lease on my car. I may not be able to buy groceries, and all of those things have lasting effects. Being able to just move money you've already earned around with no interest can be transformative, and the employer shouldn't care. Other than the transaction cost, the employer should be like, great, I'd love to offer that. It's hard to do. We created this tool for garment workers, and now we're going to scale it up, but in South Asia, and found 25% less likely to leave, double-digit increases in productivity, just tremendous effects. So now we've got all of these things, and we're facing this challenge of like, well, the market still doesn't look very sexy to anybody. It's like not large, it's not high it's like, it seems like very low marginal revenue kinds of things. So if you scale this, you'd have to hit crazy volume. And so we're still, we can create value, but create value for whom and how much and how quickly. And so that's the notion we're kind of working on now.
And so as you continue to work with firms and companies to, show them the business benefit, but also the purpose benefit as well, what do you see from the leaders that get it? How are they staying in touch with those needs of the frontline workers? Because we talked about that disconnect before. And then are there themes in the companies and firms that do get it? Is it something about their purpose? Is it something about their DNA, their values, their culture? Have you seen any themes with the folks that kind of get it and understand it?
A great question. Although I've developed a great respect for qualitative research, human-centered design, all of which we kind of do in the lab, I'm trained as a quantitative researcher, and we're not far enough out for the weak law of large numbers to work here in some sense for me. So there's not quite enough companies yet, but there are patterns. I actually think one of the biggest patterns is that humility. Like there isn't a CEO on the planet who knows truly. They might have a sense of like, yeah, frontline productivity drives my bottom line. Okay, fine. That makes good sense. I can model that and so on. What that person's life is like, no chance.
Yeah.
You know? Um, and that's okay. I'm not judging somebody for that. We come from different walks of lives and we have different purposes even within this company. The humility is in kind of saying, look, it's important for me to figure out what that is, or have somebody figure out what it is, and then do something about it, or have somebody do something about it. And that's where I think we've seen the difference. That very first company we worked with, it's called Shahi Exports, one of the largest producers of garments in the world. They have, don't get me wrong, like any other large company, there's problems. They're going to continue to have issues, and there's work to be done for sure. What struck me from the very beginning and still strikes me today is the scientific mindset, that was just like, we're sure there's better ways to do things. We're the biggest and the fastest growing, and yet we know we're doing things wrong.
Mm.
So we're happy for you to come in,
Mhm.
do whatever you've got to do, run your experiments, do your stuff, almost like, free reign up against some constraints.
Yeah.
Because if you can tell us some things, then like we're the better for it, you know? And the other thing is a true desire to want to do things better. Yes, things are competitive, margins are thin, you've got to keep the lights on. You have to live to fight another day to keep growing. But there is actually a true sense in that company of wanting to being driven by the employment you're giving
Mhm.
to a population that doesn't have that many opportunities, and that you want to do more of it. I think they've now internalized, and there's more to do, but they've internalized the notion that we don't want to just give employment, we want to give good employment. And so there's a lot of work to do there. But also that, you know, we can, if we make the lives of each of these workers better and the work environment better and so on, that's actually just a better way to run a company. It's a more productive way to run a company. We will actually lose less of these workers. Not all of them are leaving because they're going to get married and have kids and, go back to their village or whatever. That can be some of it, but we're not going to write off this problem as like, yeah, we understand. It's like unsolvable. And the reason for that, at least for that company, is fascinating, is that the company literally started with my friend's grandmother, who
Mm.
was a seamstress in a factory in the early 70s, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, and had to quit her job because she felt her boys were, her sons were not like were getting in a little trouble, and she wanted to make sure she was paying attention to them and so on. One of her sons was skipping school, I think, is what I heard, and so, but then the manager said, "Look, you're really good. Take some of these things home. Take a machine home. Take some of these orders home. Do the stuff and drop them off when you're done, and do this kind of like as a contracting." Soon she started getting her neighbors involved and so on and so forth. Well, one of those sons grew up, went to college, and then took the company forward in India. Another son went to the US and created a importing business, and the rest is history. Literally, the largest in the region and one of the top 5 in the world in volume. But they still remember that. I mean, my friend's grandmother is still alive and there, and up until very recently, used to go to the office every day. And
Mhm.
so there is that sense of, it wasn't like, the history is there and it wasn't forgotten. Not every company is going to have that. Um, but I think the implications that you can still have, like the true interest in saying, look, this company, yes, is about making widgets, but it's also about the people who make widgets, because, like without those people, we're done. And it could even be about the technology we use and the value we create by making those widgets. Okay, well, if we're going to be trailblazers there, can we do it in the best, most sustainable, most, efficient way possible? And so I think that's a theme for sure. And certainly, we're now in Latin America, in fast food and retail and automobile manufacturing, electronics manufacturing, and China and Southeast Asia and so on, which is really humbling and amazing. And I think we still have more to do. But there are common themes. Worker turnover is always an issue. Worker absenteeism is very much an issue everywhere in the developing world, even elsewhere, but certainly in the developing world and in these particular industries, even, everywhere. And productivity is low everywhere. Um, and so I think, definitely one theme is to not accept the status quo,
Mhm.
in addition to not believing you know how to do everything well and like, well, we've been doing this for decades, so like, who are you? Don't get me wrong, who am I don't know. I mean, like, I've now been doing it for over a decade, but at that time I was a kid, and so that's why it's even more amazing that that firm was willing to let me come in there with some ideas and so on. But that notion that somebody else might know, but also that notion that there's probably always a better way, and that finding the better way is worth doing, even if you can't do it yourself. Like if a company spent all its money on introspection, it probably would fail. I mean, it wouldn't make enough widgets,
Yeah.
but um but when the opportunity presents itself, being open to that and truly believing that there are better ways, is really critical. And I think the other thing that I've seen is that internal experimentation is a lot more than we think.
Mm.
Like, we run experiments, we need a large enough N, right? So I need to do
Yeah.
it across a certain number of factories, a certain number of managers, whatever it might be. But the reality is that the people who really know what's going on are those frontline managers, those frontline workers, those all these middle management layers and so on. And the reality is, left to their own devices, they're figuring it out, you know, a little bit at a time. But there's no way to consolidate that stuff and scale up the way, certain things that work. Companies that have Kaizen systems
Mhm.
tend to do well, and that's really what it's a major underpinning. In fact, you know, we're writing up the paper now, but that last experiment on the worker voice tool, I think, shows this, that one channel why the productivity is better is because, along with saying, hey, there's no soap in the bathroom and it's always dirty. Oh, my paycheck has an issue. Hey, I'm being harassed. There's also workers who are saying all these machines are miscalibrated.
Mm.
Like, we need to get a different type of yarn. These fabrics are too thick for this. I mean, I'm making up examples. We actually have some of those um, suggestions and so on, but they're making productive suggestions because who's going to know other than them?
Yeah.
And so I think also another theme is companies that realize the value the knowledge that's being created right at the bottom of the pyramid and every layer above, and figuring out ways to let that flow up, consolidating it, analyzing it, valuing it as an asset, the workers and the knowledge they create.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I have loved our conversation so much. And I just want to thank you for sharing your thought leadership, sharing your career story and your inspirations and just the work that you do. I'd love to understand that our listeners can keep connected to you, and best way to even learn more about the Good Business Lab.
Yeah, so we're overhauling our website, but I think it's due to be done now and hopefully have be a lot more accessible. But there's always avenues there to connect with us. So at goodbusinesslab.org, Google us and reach out to us, and we're always looking for opportunities. Anyone who has a workplace where you think you might want to try something, or a workplace where you want to just try to implement what we've already learned, we couldn't be more excited about that. We're looking to, to kind of every opportunity we get. I mean, I think you asked me what the vision of or mission of the lab was early on, and I don't know that I ever answered it. So our tagline is worker well-being is good business.
Mm.
I think our mission in some sense is to drive that message in every corner of the world. Every business thinks of their workers differently. They think of them as a productive asset to be invested in and maintained and upgraded, not a liability on the balance sheet, not just a cost center. And I think that that's a lofty goal that's going to take a lot of time and a lot of partners. And so we're always looking for help.
Yeah. Well, I am so happy that we were able to connect and share this space together today. And thank you so, so much for sharing your thought leadership. And we'll put the contact info and the website in our show notes for our listeners to find easily. But thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
That wraps up today's episode of You Belong in the C-Suite. Thanks again to Anant for joining me and for sharing his experience and insights. As I leave you today, I want you to think about the themes from this conversation that resonated with you most. Do me a favor and share this episode with a colleague or a friend that would benefit from it. If you're interested in learning more about the Good Business Lab or exploring ways to bring worker-focused innovation into your workplace, check out the links in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening. And remember, your leadership belongs here. You belong in the C-Suite. I want to thank you so much for listening to the You Belong in the C-Suite podcast. If you are enjoying this content, please remember to rate and review on Apple Podcasts. By leaving a review, you are helping others find this content. We will be featuring 5-star reviews on air in upcoming episodes. Editing and support for the podcast is done by S&E Podcast Management. To get more tips and tools to help you live a life guided by your values, go to thecatchgroup.com. Keep your boundaries and take care.